Hello, my name is Derek Atkins, and this video lecture is entitled Modernity and the Moral Life. This video lecture is for the course Christian Worldview and Biblical Decision Making at the East Asia School of Theology. So in the first few video lectures, we've looked at what ethics is. Then we've looked at several different systems of ethics. We've looked at consequentialist ethics, we've looked at principle ethics, and we've looked at character or virtue ethics. In this video lecture, we're going to look at modernity. We're going to look at what modernity is, how it developed, and how it affects all of life, and how it affects the moral life, how it affects ethics. So let's look and see what modernity is. Apart from Christianity, no other worldview has had greater impact on the world since the 17th century than the worldview that is often called modernity. Even those worldviews like postmodernity that claim to somehow move us away from and beyond modernity have not been all that successful in doing so. For better and for worse, modernity infects and affects and impacts almost every aspect of the contemporary world in which we live. In many ways, it is the air that we breathe. Because of this, modernity, not unlike Christianity before it, manifests itself in a huge variety of forms as it has been incarnated into so many cultures and places across the globe. In that sense, it is almost impossible to talk about modernity as a single pure entity. It truly is the dominant worldview of the modern world, and so we give it the term modernism, and modernity. Vino Ramachandra explains all this when he so eloquently puts it this way. Modernity is the first truly global civilization to emerge in human history. Its impact is felt even in the more remote villages of the world, as much as in the universities, commercial centers, and government offices of major cities. It is full of paradoxes and ambiguities, bringing in its wake both enormous blessings and terrible sufferings. Consequently, failure to understand modernity is a failure to understand ourselves, our world, and in some ways, even God himself. For everything around us has the enduring and unmistakable imprint of the modern view of life. What is this ubiquitous view, and why has it had such a pervasive influence over the course of the last few hundred years, especially with respect to ethics and the moral life? We will attempt to begin to give an answer to these questions and more as we now seek to understand and analyze the modern worldview. So let's begin by looking at the intellectual strands of modernity. There are two main schools of thought in modernity. One is rationalism, and the other school of thought is empiricism. Rationalism is the sufficiency of reason, and it began with René Descartes. René Descartes was seeking to find a certain basis for knowledge and used the method of doubt to doubt everything but the indubitable. In the end, the only certain knowledge he had was that there was a doubting I. Thus, he claimed that certainty was found in the undeniable fact that he is a doubter who doubts. This led to his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What this succeeds in doing is elevating the knowing self, the mind or reason, to a place that is completely walled off from all sense of embodiment, community, and definition in the light of another. In the end, you wind up with a duality of nature, a split between mind and matter, where the two are seen as almost completely unrelated and irrelevant to one another. This leads us to our next point, and that is the search for a traditionless and context-free knowledge. This project leads to a new tradition, but one of the worst kind, because it lacks both self-awareness of the fact that it is a new tradition and therefore not a tradition-free perspective, and denies that it is one. It also claims for itself not so much transtemporal and omnispatial ultimacy, but something even worse, non-temporal and non-spatial ultimacy, a view of and for everywhere from nowhere. In other words, it claims to be universal, true for all people in all places at all times. It winds up ridiculously impoverished because it attempts to wipe everything away and start from scratch. But the wealth of resources deposited through time and space within the traditions of the world are left by the wayside and considered primitive, passé, unenlightened, irrational, childish, and naive. Then there is empiricism, which emphasizes the sufficiency of the senses. Early representatives of empiricism include Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton. Here are some of the characteristics of empiricism. First, empiricism emphasizes a comprehensive analytic investigation of our world. And a second characteristic of empiricism is that it attempts to create grand theories to explain everything in scientifically natural terms. Great meta-narratives or super stories arose out of this period, which attempted to comprehensively and coherently explain all of the diverse data acquired through our empirical investigations. Newton's theory of gravity was the first to provide a far-reaching theory that had significant explanatory power and was followed in the 20th century by Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, such views as quantum mechanics and string theory have attempted to provide similar comprehensive explanatory power for our existence. Another characteristic of modernity is the rejection of traditional sources of authority and the elevation of the rational evaluative self. Human reason, be it empirical or rational in nature, was seen as the new and only reliable source of authority. This especially led to rejection of divine revelation, as well as the authority of tradition and history. As Leslie Newbigin notes, modernity is distrustful of authority. It was born in a movement of emancipation from what were seen as external authorities, and its appeal was to the freedom and responsibility of the individual reason and conscience to judge between rival truth claims. The assumed result for both schools or strands of modernism was unbridled human freedom and unhindered human progress. It was honestly believed that such emancipation from history, tradition, and divine sources of authority would bring about the good of human freedom and the opportunity for unhindered intellectual and cultural progress. So let's look at some ethical implications of modernity. First is the idea of moral evolution and progress. The triumphalism of this period led to a strong belief that people and society were progressing towards some sort of perfect society where all human ills would finally be eradicated. But as the next point shows, it was a focus on the ability of human beings and not God that assumed that we were able to solve all of our own problems. And that leads to the next implication, which is a focus on humanity's ability to solve all ethical problems. This idea is set in opposition to God rather than in cooperation with him. While God has given us incredible abilities to reason and make observations, modernity's emphasis on humanity's ability to solve all ethical problems led to a rejection of biblical ethical teaching. Another implication of modernity is the irrelevance and perhaps even insidiousness or harm of the divine in ethical judgments. As I hint at in the point above, irrelevance might even be too kind a way to put it. Many felt that divine revelation was more than irrelevant. It was an insidious and dangerous hindrance to bringing about the kind of good society that modernity aspired to create. For example, Karl Marx wrote, "Religion is the opiate of the people." Another implication of modernity is the secularization and subsequent impoverishment of Christian ethics. The saddest story in all of this is that those who were supposed to safeguard ethics within the Christian tradition succumbed to the spirit of the age and began to search for ethical foundation outside of divine revelation and the traditions of the church. They cut ethics loose from the grounding that they must have in God and wound up with an emasculated and impotent form of ethical universalism that was not really universal in scope and could not cope with the changing realities of the age in which they did their ethical work. Still another implication of modernity is technophilia. Technophilia is the demand that absolutely everything be subjected to the inevitable process of technologization. Now, let's talk about the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the technological. The Industrial Revolution brought the demand and love of efficiency. Because productivity becomes a major value in modernity, the means to that end is greater efficiency. Suddenly, absolutely everything must occur with increasing efficiency. For example, we have the science of ergonomics, which began with time and motion studies of how to improve efficiency of movement on assembly lines. Why do one thing in two movements when you can accomplish the same thing with a single movement? This is the kind of thinking that comes with this demand for and love of efficiency. Another effect is the passionate push for a sense of control over nature, human relationships, and the self. This demand for efficiency drives the various relationships we have with nature, each other, and even ourselves into a desire for control. The scientific method drives toward the harnessing of nature, and since we humans are part of that natural system, we too are subject to this means of control or harnessing for the betterment of all humanity and creation. In the end, much of this sense of control proved to be an illusion. For example, back in the 1950s, there were serious proposals to use atomic weapons to stop hurricanes. I mean, can you imagine the insanity of nuking hurricanes? And yet this proposal was seriously considered, and it is actually symptomatic of this drive for humans to gain control over complete mastery over nature. So let's talk about the ethics of the technological. All of this technological progress has brought new ethical dilemmas and the myth of technological control. New technologies and scientific advances created new ethical problems that seem to call biblical morals into question. Bioethics, for example, arose from new technological advances that created difficult moral decisions that even just a few decades ago would not have needed to be made. Environmental issues have arisen out of the industrial damage that has been done to the ecosystem. Human beings tend to think that if they created some new technology, then they can also control it. But things are just not that simple. Some technologies inherently overwhelm human capabilities and raise difficult ethical problems regarding personal responsibility and the appropriate limit of scientific and technological development. For example, Dennis Hollinger writes, technology always carries with it a certain kind of control over us. The premise that we can easily control technologies toward moral ends is not at all self-evident. Most of the great ethical issues grappled with today are somehow related to our technological sophistication. Our capabilities to create and manufacture outpace our moral sensibilities. Another consequence is the ascendance of technique over morality. When technology becomes the driving factor in society, moral issues tend to be pushed to the back burner and solved by applying more and more efficient technological solutions. People are controlled to do what is beneficial to the social order by increasingly impersonal and efficient methods and technologies rather than by means of human discourse and moral persuasion, since these are messy and inefficient and therefore seen in modernity as unproductive. There is another corollary to this idea of self-control. Because science works, it gives human beings a false sense of being in control of things that they really do not and cannot ultimately control. Dependence upon God for wisdom and ethical judgment gives way to the pursuit of better techniques for eradicating as much of the fallout and consequences of sinful activities as possible. For example, and very ironically, once we thought we could control pregnancy with the technologies of birth control, why not call it pregnancy control, since pregnancy and birth are not the same thing? Was there already a hidden or latent agenda for something like abortion already present in the very coining of the term? We suddenly thought that sex outside of the marital bond would somehow be liberating. As Hollinger points out, once we have developed control over consequences deemed detrimental to human happiness or social well-being, the behavioral norms and restrictions can be lifted. So let's look at the different sociological strands of morality that are part of modernism. First, you have differentiation and specialization. As the drive for efficiency increased and the ever-extending fields of science discovered new knowledge and new ways to control and apply technologies, so too came the need for an explosion of specialization. Here's one sign of this. Beginning around 1850, there was an explosion of new academic societies. With each passing decade, more and more academic societies were founded. This reflected the ever-increasing drive toward specialization. In economic, there have also been effects in economic production and labor. Okay, going back to specialization in economic production and labor. New technologies and fields of study led to jobs becoming ever more specialized. For example, doctors went from being general practitioners to focusing on ever more specialized areas of medicine, such as cardiology, pulmonology, immunology, etc. There's also been specialization in education. We now have all kinds of majors and minors and types of schools for various fields in which a person might venture to go and to learn. We also have specialization in politics and law. The law became increasingly concerned with regulating the technological and the grand systems that arose in modernity. No longer could law be something concerned with wisdom and character alone, the wise application of ethical norms. Instead, there was a growing need for specialists to deal with legal structures and regulatory aspects of an increasingly technological society. So too with politics, which was forced into organizing increasingly larger and more complex systems and communities of people. Gone were the days when people largely governed themselves and took care of their own needs and aspects of infrastructure. Compare Mama's farm with our life in Singapore, for example. With the rise of larger and larger nation states, politics is felt more and more at every level of life. Then there's the effect of modernity on applied ethics. The problem created here is that ethical living is less and less comprehensive and coherent in the increasingly fragmented world of modernity. The idea of an overarching meta-ethic from which to live one's life in an integrated way seems to becoming increasingly implausible. And then we have pluralism. During the past 200 years or so, pluralism has become an increasingly prominent feature of modernity. So here is a definition of pluralism. Pluralism is the existence of different types of people who have different beliefs and opinions within the same society. So this is talking for, we see this very clearly here in Singapore, where we have people from many different religions living in the same city. We have Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, and even some Jews and others living in this city. We also have, as well as atheists. We also have people from different worldviews living in this city. We have people with more of an Eastern or Asian worldview, and we have people with a more Western worldview living in the same city. So we see pluralism on full display here in Singapore. So there are many different aspects, there are many different dimensions of pluralism, including geographic mobility. Never before have so many people been able to travel so far in so little time. There's also the dimension of information exchange. Beginning with the telegraph, the rise of global technologies led to the exponential proliferation of information exchange. What happens in one part of the world can now have almost real-time, immediate consequences in many other parts of the world. We also have the rise of cosmopolitan centers, that is, global cities. What all of this does is create new sociological realities where people from widely divergent communities with widely divergent ways of understanding and living in the world now live in close proximity to one another and significantly interact with each other in regular and ongoing ways. And this, in turn, results in the kinds of challenges that we'll talk about now. Here are some of the challenges that come with pluralism. There are challenges to basic religious and ethical conceptions of reality. When you are constantly engaged with and confronted by other ways of seeing and living in the world, you cannot avoid being impacted by this, both for better and for worse. According to Hollinger, this has two basic consequences for Christian ethics, which we'll look at now. First is the justification for ethical relativism. If there are so many competing, apparently successful ways of living in the world, then how can Christians, for example, possibly claim a universal ethic for all humanity in every time and place? We also have the marginalization of a specifically Christian viewpoint. When pluralism is the order of the day, Christian ethics loses its universal force and becomes just one more option in a great plethora of other possible options and strategies for successful living in, that is, coping with the contemporary world. This idea provides a natural segue into the next sociological result of modernity's way of thinking and being. In short, we are led wholesale into secularization. And here's what Dennis Hollinger says about secularization. Though religion still plays a significant role in the lives of people and continues to influence societies and cultures, it does not play the same role it once played in relation to major social institutions such as government, economics, education, and law. Within secularized societies, religion tends to have minimal impact on the larger societal institutions and the main contours of cultural life. Religion, therefore, is one social institution alongside others, no longer providing the overarching framework for the society. This is not the disappearance of religion in general and religious ethics in particular, but it certainly is the marginalization of it, and that creates unique challenges for the Christian ethicist in a modern and now increasingly postmodern world. This is why the next point deserves a separate highlighting in the modernistic setting, and that is privatization of religion. Because of specialization in modernity, the split between the public and the private inevitably happens in all areas, but the result for religion is clear. It becomes a matter of distinctly private practice and concern and should remain in its proper place. The implication for the idea of a distinctly Christian ethic having an impact on the public arena is also very clear. This realm is perceived to be largely, if not completely, immune and properly indifferent to such influences. We will discuss possible solutions to this looming problem later on in the course, but for now, we must come to grips with where we stand in the Christian ethical enterprise in a world that has been transformed by the modernist ethos. As Vinoth Ramachandra so clearly points out in his quote toward the beginning of this lesson, modernity has brought incredible benefits to the world, but they have come with a terrible price as well. So this is an introduction to modernity. We've looked at what modernity is, how it came to be, how it affects our world today, and how it affects moral ethics today. In the next video lecture, we're going to move on from modernity to post-modernity. So please go on to the next video and let's find out what post-modernity is about and how post-modernity affects our world today.